Hermann Göring ominously summarized German policy towards the Soviet Union when he made a typically sinister speech late in 1941. Many tens of millions in the industrial areas will become redundant and will either die or have to emigrate to Siberia. In little more than 1 year, Göring's promise had been made good. Hitler's armies had reduced vast areas of Western Russia to dust and rubble and subjected the Soviet peoples to unimaginable brutality. Russia experienced an agony of brutality as she was dragged through a nightmare of slaughter to the edge of extinction. The launch of Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June 1941, was Germany's most desperate gamble of the Second World War. It was a gamble Hitler felt compelled to take if his ambition of the complete subjugation of Europe was to become a reality. 3 million German troops were initially committed to the most appalling conflict in the history of warfare. In the course of the next 4 years, she would need to find 3 million more. The whole ideological thrust of the German plan for war was different. This was not a conventional war of conquest. It was intended to be a war of extermination. It was intended to root out what Hitler called the Jewish Bolshevik gang who ran Russia. It was designed to destroy the political structure both of the Soviet Union and of the Red Army. In consequence, the terrible barbarization which set in at the first stage in the Soviet-German war was to become the overriding feature which persisted until the very last day of that war. Standing between Hitler and the realization of this vision were the armies of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, a fighting force whose condition of disorganization was mirrored by the paranoia of its political leadership. The disarray in the ranks of the Red Army was a direct result of the excesses of Stalin, who had carried out a systematic purge of the Red Army. In 1936, Tukhachevsky, chief of staff of the Russian army, was executed for treason following a trial which lasted only a single day. 6 of the 8 generals forming the court-martial which condemned him were themselves to follow suit soon after. By the end of the purge, the Russian army had lost 3 of the 5 remaining marshals of the Soviet Union, all 11 deputy ministers of defense, 75 of the 80 members of the military Soviet, all the commanders of the military districts, 13 of the 15 army commanders, more than half the corps commanders, and approximately 30% of the officers below brigade level.
The performance of the Russian tank forces was affected by 3 major considerations. The first one was that during the purges in the late 1930s, early 1940s, well over 90% of all the tank commanders were shot, and so there was a dearth of experienced tank commanders. A lot of the senior commanders who were actually replaced after the fiasco in Finland in 1940, they were actually reinstated, even though they had a poor track record. They went back in and commanded these units. The units, because they were so large, because there was over 24,000 tanks, the Russians really couldn't afford to spend a great deal of time training the crews, and most of the training that the crews had was for exercises more for the Politburo and for propaganda purposes rather than actual tactical exercises. And the third factor was there was very little in the way, or almost no, spare parts. So when a vehicle broke down, unless they cannibalized another vehicle, there was no spare parts for that vehicle.
This great offensive, codenamed Barbarossa, had been fermenting for a long time in Hitler's mind. Firmly rooted in National Socialist ideology was the conviction that Germany's destiny lay in the East. Once more, Hitler needed a quick war. Once more, he needed it soon. It was his instinct that Germany would never stand so strong as she stood then. His gambler's instinct told him that if he delayed even 1 year, the crowds that cheered the latest successes so fervently might no longer be willing to follow him into so hazardous an adventure. And there was no greater military adventure than the invasion of Russia. As the German build-up towards Operation Barbarossa continued, Stalin's attempts to pacify Hitler grew more desperate. Stalin felt he was continuing to buy time by these unrequited concessions. But his use of the breathing space, which he had already obtained, was totally devoid of any worthwhile attempt to remedy his military disadvantages.
Stalin was well aware that sooner or later the Germans would attack. But what accompanied this was as follows, actually. There was also the assumption, very deftly introduced by the Germans, that in fact, before this attack, there could well be negotiations. There might even be, and the Russians now have disclosed this, there might even have been a personal meeting between Hitler and Stalin. And Stalin therefore became persuaded that there were two elements to this German position. One was that the massive German military buildup was in fact, if you like, not an inducement, but a form of coercion to force him into a negotiating position. And on June the 14th, he made this perfectly plain by the famous TASS statement saying, look, we know what you're up to. We know all about these concentrations, but there is nothing to prevent a settlement of Soviet-German relations. That was the first thing. The second thing was a certain element of self-deception on Stalin's side, to the effect that, one, he strongly believed that Hitler would never embark on a two-front war. And the second thing was, again, Stalin's great concern that although the Soviet General Staff, Zhukov and Vasilevsky and others, and particularly Timoshenko, were urging Stalin to mobilize, Stalin argued actually, and he shouted at Timoshenko, what do you want, a war? Because the act of mobilization, full formal mobilization, essentially would trigger war. Indeed, even on the morning of the 22nd of June 1941, when the German army is advancing, he's still partly persuaded of what he thought was a provocatia. He even imagined it was some breakaway German generals who were trying it on, as it were. This wasn't the real thing. So that the explanation of Soviet unreadiness is much more complex than the fact that, yes, they knew about it, B, they did nothing about it. And it was certainly plain from Stalin's statements that he did expect a war, which he hoped through his diplomacy and his general political initiatives to postpone to 1942. The reality of it was that Hitler meant every word he said. He would attack on the 22nd of June 41, and he did attack.
By June 1941, with a German attack imminent, the Western Special Military District on which the blow would fall was nothing short of a shambles. Many divisions were between 6,000 to 7,000 men short of wartime establishment. Levies of experienced personnel had been hived off to build new tank and aviation units. Only one of 6 mechanized corps had received their full complement of equipment. 3 of the 4 motorized divisions had no tanks, and 4 out of every 5 vehicles in the tank fleets were obsolete. 4 of the corps had only 1/4 of their designated motor vehicles, and in another 4, 1 in 3 motor vehicles needed repairs. Although the two opposing forces had amassed vast amounts of weaponry along their common borders, the Soviet Red Army and the German Wehrmacht were anything but equal adversaries. Russian armored warfare was inhibited by Stalin's disenchantment with tank divisions, which had led him, in the 30s, to utilize his armor only in the support of infantry formations. After witnessing German successes on the Western Front in 1940, Stalin changed his mind. But the reorganization of Russian armor was not completed before the launch of Barbarossa. Even though Russian tanks outnumbered German 2-to-1 at the front and 6-to-1 overall, tactical ineffectiveness, obsolete models, and widespread disrepair tipped the advantage overwhelmingly in favor of Germany during the first stages of the conflict. In the western part of Russia, the Red Army consisted of about 5 million men. The tank strength of the Red Army on the 21st of June 1941 was 23,108, of which possibly 8,000 were battle-ready and in good condition. Typical of the Russian tank forces in the early part of the war was the T-26.
Well, the T-26 was built under license from a design that was originally created by Vickers Armstrong in about 1928, so it was a British tank. You can always tell it was